Looking at this animated map of the United States in 1819, the young country appeared to sit in perfect political harmony. Exactly 11 northern free states and exactly 11 southern slave states maintained an equal balance of representation and influence in federal affairs. Beneath that geographic symmetry, however, the two regions were developing wildly different cultures. The northern states were rapidly industrializing, allowing citizens the economic freedom to question the moral standing of slavery. The southern economy, driven by the invention of the cotton gin, was entirely dependent on plantation agriculture and enslaved labor to survive. This balance relied on the borders staying exactly where they were, but a growing movement of Americans now believed it was the nation's destiny to expand westward as far as possible. That problem came to a head only a year later. In 1820, the Missouri Territory pushed for statehood. Because its settlers leaned heavily toward permitting slavery, admitting Missouri threatened to break the 11-to-11 tie in Congress and give the South a permanent legislative advantage. To fix the crisis, Congress passed the Missouri Compromise. On this historical map, you see their solution, admitting Missouri as a slave state and carving out Maine as a free state. They established a hard border across the western territories at the 36° 30' latitude line, making new territory above it free. While this legislation quieted the immediate panic, it completely failed to address the moral divide. Instead, it triggered a furious race for land, tying political survival directly to geography. Every time a free state was added to the map, a slave state had to be added to counter it. By 1845, the rules of that race were breaking down. Texas, having won its independence from Mexico, demanded annexation into the United States. Because Texas wanted to join as a massive new slave state, it offset the exact numerical balance the Northerners had fought so carefully to maintain. The newly elected president, James K. Polk, was an aggressive supporter of westward expansion. When he couldn't purchase California and New Mexico, he intentionally sent American troops to the Texas border to provoke Mexican forces, giving him the excuse he needed to declare the Mexican-American War. The United States won the conflict and seized massive tracts of western land, spanning from modern-day Wyoming to California. The sheer volume of this newly acquired territory meant the old Missouri Compromise line was entirely obsolete. Take a close look at this warning poster from Boston in 1851. It highlights a critical part of the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act. The federal government mandated that Northerners actively participate in returning escaped slaves. This deeply troubled Northern citizens and fiercely galvanized the abolitionist movement. The situation grew even more volatile with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Senator Stephen Douglas introduced popular sovereignty, a policy wiping away old geographic borders and allowing local settlers in the new territories to vote on permitting or banning slavery themselves. By adopting popular sovereignty, the federal government effectively stepped back, leaving the explosive question of slavery to be decided by whichever side could get the most settlers into a territory first. That competition erupted into a tragedy known as Bleeding Kansas. Desperate to sway the upcoming vote, rival factions of heavily armed pro- and anti-slavery settlers flooded across the borders. The territory devolved into a split government and 4 years of brutal guerrilla warfare that left hundreds of Americans dead. In 1856, the violence reached the Senate floor. After delivering an impassioned speech condemning slavery and the chaos in Kansas, Northern Republican Charles Sumner was physically assaulted by a Southern representative and beaten so severely with a cane that he required 3 years to recover. The legal system offered no relief. In 1857, the Supreme Court handed down the devastating Dred Scott decision. The court ruled against Scott, an enslaved man suing for his freedom, declaring that Black Americans lacked the ability to be United States citizens and therefore had no right to sue in federal court. 2 years later, the radical abolitionist John Brown launched a deadly raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry. He intended to seize weapons and forcibly spark a local slave rebellion. He was captured by local militia and Marines and subsequently hanged for treason. By the end of the 1850s, the complete failure of the courts and the legislature to resolve the dispute meant that raw physical violence was the only remaining form of political expression. The final tipping point arrived with the election of 1860. The victory of Northern anti-slavery Republican Abraham Lincoln signaled to Southern states that they had lost all remaining political leverage in Washington. This 1860 presidential campaign map clearly shows the intense polarization. Immediately after the election, South Carolina voted unanimously to secede from the United States, issuing the document that explicitly stated a hard geographical line had finally been drawn across the Union. Within months, 10 more Southern states followed suit, breaking away to form the Confederate States of America and choosing Jefferson Davis as their president. This visualization reveals the vast imbalance between the divided forces. The Union retained 22 million citizens, while the South held only 9 million. Expanding the data shows the North's overwhelming logistical supremacy, possessing double the railroad tracks and producing 90% of manufactured goods. When undersupplied Union soldiers refused to surrender Fort Sumter, the Confederate forces opened fire, officially igniting the American Civil War. The young nation's relentless obsession with physically expanding its borders ultimately forced the issue of slavery to a breaking point, creating a geographic and moral divide too wide to survive.